This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 186 of the De Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. Language evaluations are challenging enough, but when we're evaluating multilingual and bilingual students, they become even more complex. Language in state education codes may not take the nuance of multilingual evaluations into account, which means they may unintentionally encourage protocols that don't enable clinicians to conduct quality evaluations and service plans. When clinicians ask me about language evaluations, the questions are typically things like, what tools and protocols can I use? Who can I go to for help? And how can I advocate for change if current policies don't support best practices? That's why I invited Prabhu Eswaran and Puja Goel to episode 186 to help answer some of these questions as they relate to multilingual learners. Prabhu is an ASHA certified school-based speech-language pathologist in Los Angeles, California. His areas of interest include child language disorders, communication disorders in culturally and linguistically diverse populations, and technology in special education. He is now serving in the advisory board of the MCCG SAC-ASHA's executive board. Puja is a multilingual school-based speech-language pathologist who has worked for the Chicago Public Schools and currently works in New Mexico as a supervising SLP. Puja recently completed her administrative licensure in the state of New Mexico, which allows her to work as an administrator in schools. She is a member of ASHA, CASE, and appointed to the NAP. Puja is predominantly school-based, but has worked across all settings: early intervention, private practice, acute care, skilled nursing facilities, and outpatient settings. She completed the American Speech Language Hearing Association's Leadership Development Program and Minority Student Leadership Program and served on the Multicultural Issues Board. Puja graduated from Northwestern University for her master's degree in Communication Sciences and Disorders and Smith College for her bachelor's degree in government. She earned a certification in assistive technology from the University of Illinois at Chicago and is currently pursuing a terminal degree in educational leadership. Puja is a first-generation South Asian born in the United States, and you can contact her at pujagoel2020@gmail.com. In this episode, we discuss what to do when standardized assessments aren't normed in a student's language, making a case for non-standardized data when standard scores don't provide quality information, service planning for multilingual students and recommended resources, and we wrap up by talking about getting started with advocacy at the state and national level. Before I get going, I wanted to remind you to take a look at Language Therapy Advanced Foundations if you are a clinician and you want a better system for language therapy. One of the biggest pain points I hear from clinicians is that when it comes to language, they're not quite sure where to start. They're not sure how to navigate their role in language and literacy, especially in the schools where our scope is so broad. There's so many different pieces. We have to think about how we're going to use the tools at our disposal to come up with a quality evaluation and a service plan. As you know, we can't be cookie cutter about it. We have to adapt to our students' needs, but we also can't start from scratch for every case without some kind of a framework, because that makes planning almost impossible. So I help you find a middle ground that gives you enough structure so that you know which critical components to focus on in your intervention, while at the same time incorporating enough flexibility that you can adapt it to your caseload. To learn more about Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, you can go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. Now, please enjoy this conversation with Puja and Prabhu. Today, I am joined by Prabhu Eswaran and Puja Goel. So I guess we'll kind of do a history and a background up into the current work that you're doing. So whichever one of you wants to go first.
Sure. Hi, Dr. Dudek-Brannan. Thank you for having us for this podcast. I'm a school-based SLP here in Los Angeles, and I've been an SLP since early 2000s. It's been a while.
Yeah.
I do have a wide experience working with students with varied learner profiles. Basically, I work with children with ASD, literacy needs, dual sensory impairments, and children with complex communication needs. Pretty much, I'm more of a pediatric SLP.
Great. How about you, Puja?
So I've been a school-based SLP since I graduated back in 2006. I am on my now 18th year and very proud. I have not left the schools because I enjoy my work and also the trajectory that I've taken in my career within the schools. More recently, I became DEI certified, but early on in my career after graduating, I was AT certified. So I feel like I've gone from AT to DEI and everything in between, working in all types of settings within the educational parameters, including private parochial, day, specialty, charter, K-12. The list goes on and on, but I feel like I've covered a lot of various settings within our field, within the schools. And I also most recently got my administrative license, and I am currently working on graduating towards a post-master's degree / certification, which is called an EDS. So, which stands for Educational Specialist within Educational Leadership. So that's my story.
Great. Lots of things, many topics that we want to get to today. I know the two big topics that we wanted to talk about were clinical advocacy and also talking about multilingual evaluations as well as services. I mean, I think where we can start is, I know that in some previous conversations, just starting with the evaluation piece, because I think that for a lot of clinicians, evaluations are a challenge for language in general. But when you talk about multilingual evaluations, there's just so many different layers. So I guess my first question for both of you are, what are some of the biggest myths surrounding multilingual evaluations?
So I can start. I would say that a lot of SLPs who are not familiar with doing a multilingual evaluation would assume that it's very black and white, just like you would be doing a monolingual evaluation. But it's not. It's like you just said, Karen, it's very layered, and it's actually very gray. It's a very gray area that's very nebulous in a lot of ways. So there is not a black and white approach when it comes to qualifying a student for our services. That's one. I would also say another myth is that we would just think that, oh, well, what's their dominant language of use? That's just like saying somebody's not talking right. Like, talking can mean 10,000 different things in our world, right? That's not just about language. There's so many variables. So dominant language of use is kind of a very blurry term because students who are multilingual may have different languages of use in terms of expressive, receptive. And then you have to also think about like if they're thinking in that language. Are they thinking or counting in English or their native language, so to speak? The other thing, and so when you think about dominant language, it's not a very linear term. It's a very broad term. Also, decisions based off of rules for monolingual qualifying factors is also a myth, which kind of goes with the black and white approach, as I've already mentioned.
Yeah.
So just thinking that, a student can qualify based upon whatever the criteria is for the LEA or even SCA, because technically we have to go by what our state rules dictate for qualifying a student.
That's tricky. I know, and I have a colleague in California who's working on trying to start a task force to update the education code just because of, some of the issues with using cognitive referencing, which affects all students, but especially students who speak multiple languages.
Totally. And you are on the right track with where I was going to go with this, is that there is not a very clear guidance, I would say prescription within our state code manuals of how bilingual students should be qualified. I have talked to a few different SLPs from actually 3 different states, including Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Indiana, and there's nothing in the code, nothing really in their manual. It's very nebulous again, like there's nothing concretely, explicitly stated on how a multilingual student should be qualified.
Well, and I think the other challenge with the way that some guidelines are written is that there are criteria like must be so many standard deviations away from the mean. So when you don't have access to a standardized assessment in all of the languages that you might be looking at, how would you use that criteria to get the information that you need to be able to identify a student in need of services and write goals?
Bingo. And I think one of the things I've heard from a lot of clinicians is that when we collaborate is that a lot of states are now, or their districts rather, are not necessarily using the 2 standard deviation criteria for qualification.
They
it's
shouldn't.
a little bit more it's a little bit more loose.
It really depends on the state and the district. I'm in Illinois, and there are, I don't want to say gray area, but I think it's 1.5 standard deviations. It says must have 2 scores, 1.5 standard deviations, or that's at least what it was when I was in the schools. I know that there's been a lot of updates since then, but there were other criteria that you could make a case for it. And I would always try to make a case for it if it made sense. And I know that there are other SLPs in Illinois specifically, especially with students who are bilingual. And again, they are using a language sample and a narrative, and they're showing data. It's just not always in standard scores.
Right. And that's where the tricky part comes in, because if your district is telling you to make it normed or standardized, well, not normed, but standardized rather. You can't always do a standardized assessment. It's not typical in, especially languages that are not normed.
Right.
Itself is not normed in Polish, So what are you going to do? You're not going to give the self and report standardized scores because you can't. So then you got to get creative. So creativity is like the key. in my opinion.
Well, and I don't know that the self does the best job in English either. That's another conversation.
Sure.
Yes, this is the time that monolingual SLPs or any SLPs that are working with multilingual students use the dynamic assessment. So that is the way to go. It's a way to, or a method to conduct speech and language assessments to identify the skills that a child possesses, as well as to understand the learning potential.
Mhm.
For example, I pretty much often use the SLAM cards by Dr. Crowley.
Mhm.
They provide a wealth of information in an informal manner about the child's metalinguistic skills, the cognitive, language-based skills. So that would help me to come up with an informed clinical decision um, regarding whether the child has a language difference or it's really a true language disorder. And
Mhm.
that's also included in one of my a series of assessments so that I'm able to get a complete picture of the student's potential and come up with plans based on their needs.
I like how you gave that example of using materials that you have, because I think that sometimes people think, well, it's not standardized, it's not rigorous. And no, it's not normed. And yes, there are benefits to using a normed assessment, but there are also limitations that we have standardized data and we have non-standardized data, but it can still be data and it can still be high quality if we understand how to structure it the right way. What other resources do you use in your dynamic assessment? Like, do you have a set protocol, or does it vary from case to case?
It depends. Mostly I'm using the SLAM cards by Dr. Crowley. Um, Also, there are a lot of materials that are published in AJSLP, so I just take it in, and I do take help from interpreters
Mhm.
assessments. It's, for example, I have a student that speaks Korean. Obviously, I'm not fluent in Korean, or I don't know. So I do bring in an interpreter. I do ask them to interact with the student, come up with a language sample, and based on the formal interaction, I would get an understanding of the student's language abilities, and that would make a case for whether the student has a language difference or it's a language disorder.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, in addition to SLAM cards, yes, you could use interpreters, any, informal assessments that you could use, but again, you got to put it all together to make an informed clinical judgment,
What
right?
kinds of things do you have to do to prepare to work with the interpreter? Or, I mean, I'm just thinking about if there was an SLP who was walking in and had never done a multilingual evaluation and they were using the interpreter for the first time, what kind of advice would you give as far as just understanding the process and preparing and knowing how to use the interpreter during the evaluation and in that interaction?
So yeah, I mean, of course, I do work with interpreters and translators. Pretty much, we just want to collaborate with them in a positive way so that we explain to them the need as to why they are here with us for this assessment. For example, here in LAUSD, we do get calls for quite a lot of students who speak Indian languages, and I do
Mhm.
as well. Um, so basically, I explain to them as to why they are there. It could be a parent, it could be a certified bilingual interpreter, or it could be a teacher who's willing to provide or share their expertise, right? So the point is we need to explain to them as to why they are there. First and foremost, I would have them, just build a rapport with the child, do an informal interaction, play with them so that you set uh, the setting, you set the path for a proper evaluation, and then you would introduce your formal questions and more of like a picture identification, more of like formulation of sentences, more of taking a language sample. So once you have all those, after the evaluation, I would, have a one-on-one with the interpreter and ask them, hey, what do you think about this? How is this language sample? Do you observe any grammatical errors and how this child is forming the sentences. Is there a variance in the vocabulary, or is it age appropriate? And specifically the sound system, say, for example, in Korean or in Spanish, which I'm not familiar with.
Puja, what advice would you give to people using interpreters?
It's really easy for an interpreter to not understand what we're looking for. If you have everything done in writing, I think also they can circle like the errors as well. So for example, like if you have like a clipboard and they're saying what they're supposed to, and then they write it down, then they're going to circle like, okay, this is what they should have said. But they could also say, well, in Polish, we don't do that. That's not part of typical language use within Polish. So these evaluations are not easy to ascertain, right? It takes a lot of analytical skill and acumen to really determine if there's a disorder and not just a difference.
What kinds of things do you have to talk about with interpreters as far as the way that they translate what the child is saying back to the questions, or how you're eliciting? Because I've heard, for example, when, let's say a clinician is talking with the interpreter and the child, and I think the example was the interpreter said, well, the child said apple. And she said, well, actually she said orange, but she meant apple. And so the clinician had to say, well, you can't infer, we've got to give exact information about what the child is saying so that we can tell, are they able to name objects? Are they able to use certain grammatical structures? So I'm curious if you've ever had experience with something like that and had to do some training or coaching as you're working with different interpreters.
Yes. Again, you just need to, when you have the debrief session, you need to very specific questions for the interpreter. There's no room for error or judgment. You just have to ask, what did the child say for this picture? She meant to say mango for an apple. So mango is the response. It's not an apple.
Right.
So be very specific so that it's not just that one example. Maybe you will look into the different samples, maybe 4 or 5 or whatever it is. So you would know, okay, the child has needs in vocabulary. We got to work into it. So just basically, we will have to make a informed clinical judgment again to understand it's not a language difference, but it's truly a language disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that we need to really consider is the child's exposure to English in this country, right? So that's something we always look into, and also the family background, their strong native language that they speak in their homes, their EL status, the English language learner status. So that's something we got to look into. In California, we use the CEL scores, so that's something we need to look into as well. LPAC. So we got to look at all the details, put them together so that you are able to make an informed decision about the child's needs.
I'm going to take a quick break here to talk about Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, my program that helps SLPs create a system for language therapy by focusing on the essential components of vocabulary that help students develop a foundation to support strategic planning, to support high-level processing, and to give them those vocabulary and syntactic skills they need that are going to support literacy and life outcomes. As a clinician, especially if you are in the schools, it can be really difficult to know where to start. In fact, that's probably the biggest pain point that I hear from school SLPs is, where the heck do I start? What is my hierarchy? How can I prioritize all these possible skills when my students have so many different needs and I have so many different people telling me all these different messages about where I should be focusing. What I do in Language Therapy Advanced Foundations is give you a 5-component framework that supports those language skills that are going to build the foundation that students need to support their academic skills, their vocational skills, their reading and writing skills, all those things that are going to help them be successful in school and in life beyond school. That 5-component framework focuses on vocabulary as the core umbrella area where we are supporting students. And the elements that fit under that umbrella are orthography, morphology, phonology, semantics, and syntax. So we're building a foundation for students to have that high-level processing, to be able to understand sentences at the word level, at the sentence level, and to be able to formulate complex thoughts for high-level strategic planning. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy.
I'd love to talk about the idea of differences versus disorders and dominant language, because I think sometimes people will use the term heritage language or native language. So I'm curious how both of you think about that and make that distinction in your practice, and how, most importantly, how do we use that information to make good decisions about services?
So, I mean, as far as a difference, I think one of the easy peasy things that we think about is dialectical differences. When it comes to an accent, for example, that's probably one of the most basic differences that a lot of children would exhibit, especially if English was not their native language, or they just, migrated from elsewhere. They're not gonna speak English in a standard American English manner that we would expect a student who was, born and brought up in USA to speak. So differences must be advocated, in my opinion, as non-negotiable, and bottom line, not eligible. It's very simple. You can even use a differences equals or does not equal eligibility, because it's very straightforward. With disorders, though, we have to think about the presence of the disorder in their native language other than English. And you also have to incorporate other things that, might be overlooked. So we've already talked about the interpreter, which is definitely a very important person within the scheme of analyzing language from a speech perspective and also a language perspective. But, we want to look at the English scan. We want to look at the SAC-ASHA scores to draw conclusions. Service provision does not typically include treatment within their native language. So, for example, I'm just using Polish. I don't know why it came into my mind, but I just came back from Eastern Europe. So if you don't have a Polish speaking SLP, you have to think about, well, what are you going to do for the student?
Yeah.
Who actually
and the intervention.
What is the intervention going to look like? Well, you've got to get creative again. And that's where you have to think about the focus of identifying the needs in both English and Polish. So I usually visually try to talk about the Venn diagram, because whatever is shared in both languages is what needs to be drilled. So it's really important to understand what a disorder looks like, but you also have to make sure you're looking at various components, not just, diagnostically, but like you have to look at other things. Like I had, mentioned the SAC-ASHA, and Prabhu, I think, mentioned earlier something that they use in California, Prabhu.
That's the English language proficiency assessments for California.
We can link to it in the show notes too, so people can look it
Yeah.
up. Yeah, we'll
Yeah,
do that for both of
absolutely.
these assessments, and we could
Yes.
link to
And
the
access
SLAM cards
scores,
too.
and access scores also are important. They look at different things, but basically the access scores look at when a student ends up becoming English proficient. And if they have, the score basically goes up to a 6.
Mhm.
And so usually what is the rule of thumb is like once a student is at 4 or above, they typically do not require intervention any longer.
Okay.
Or like, for example, they may not require ELL services or ESL services if they're receiving that, because they're not really deemed any longer as an ESL or ELL student. So those would be important to look at, because if the student is already acing the access score testing, then you'd also have to think about like, okay, well, what am I doing here? Why am I testing the student in Polish if they're already proficient in English? I mean, a lot of this stuff, believe it or not, is a lot of common sense, but we just make it a little more complicated for ourselves, and we don't really need to. But I mean, if you were to think about that, it would make sense. Like, why am I here to test if the student already knows English? Because then we're not here to fix language disorders that are within their native language if they're proficient in English, right? We don't do that in the schools. So,
I've never thought of it that way. And
right.
and I think the challenge there is that if you're in a school system that primarily, where English is primarily the language, how would you identify a language disorder if it's not a language that's typically used in that school system? I mean, typically when there's a referral, it's, in the US school systems, if you're primarily speaking English, whoever is making the referral would I mean, more often than not, you'd notice that in English, unless you had a student who was, bilingual and in a program that used multiple languages, and the teachers were noticing it in both languages. So for example, if they were, getting ELL services but not identified for special education services, and it came up that way.
Yeah, I mean, again, like, this is just not, it can be very, I don't know how to say it, but confusing when you're not looking at variables across the board. If a student, typically, like, there's certain indicators as to why you would qualify for even testing to begin with. So if the student wasn't proficient in English, obviously, their access scores would be very low. But then you have to really think about, like, okay, do they have a disorder in that language, in their native language? So yes, you would want their access scores to be lower, but there's also just ways of looking at information where you can automatically kind of like curtail like the time involved, because as a school-based clinician, we don't get a lot of time to do these evals. This is not like a private practice where, a parent could essentially go in and get a private evaluation if they wanted to. And by the way, differences would be accounted for in those situations. But in the schools, typically public K-12, like, you're not going to look at a difference really at all, unless it's impacting them socially or academically maybe, but more than likely not.
Well, and I think those students who have differences would be more in ELL programs rather than getting speech and language services. So have either of you ever been in a situation relating to an evaluation where there was a disagreement between maybe you and your administration or you and your team about what you should do for a student? And like, how did you handle that?
I have, absolutely. This happens a lot. And over time, you just get more comfortable with dissension. Okay. But I would say is you don't want to be dealing with this at the table at an IEP meeting. So if there's a question about what's going on with this case, then it needs to be handled either before the meeting or after the meeting, because you're not looking to pull out, the dog and pony show in front of the parent. You just don't want to go there because you of course want to, be professional at the table, but you don't need to like skirt and dance around stuff and just make everything look awkward. IEPs can also be paused and can be reconvened. A lot of IEP facilitators don't take that route, but often they need to be. So I would ask the SLP to step it up and just say, hey, we need to stop the meeting. You don't want matters to escalate because something can turn into a due process very fast before you blink your eyes. And you don't want there to be an altercation. It's just not appropriate. It's really important. I mean, this is information that I've learned over time. This is not really something that you would know or be skilled to handle overnight. But I think that like sometimes, when we're new rookies, we don't know what to do. We all have a first time at everything. I mean, we're in a field where, we're a helping hand and we bring in a lot of money. So I think it's important to feel and be respected for what you're there to do. And so it's important to educate. So educate and advocate.
My other question about advocacy is, what do you think clinicians are doing right and wrong when it comes to advocacy initiatives in the field?
Not taking into account the perspective of the family is a very big problem because most clinicians are listening actively, but you also have to think about putting yourself in their shoes. Okay. Especially if it's like a situation where like there's a low socioeconomic status situation going on. It could be a homeless situation going on. I mean, you don't know. It could be a migrant situation going on, which is more multi-layered. It's a layered situation altogether. So if you're not taking into account the perspective of the family, it's an issue. Citing a department or district directive or procedure without really understanding the needs is an issue because a family is not going to get that. They probably don't even care. It has to be approached in a very different way. You got to have that person that you can contact for guidance. Counseling the family at the IEP table and taking time to explain the bell curve or the eligibility determination process while you're listening to their needs is very important and should be continued. And these are my C's, but being courageously confident and creative by doing your homework to ask for clarifications from your administration may be a better approach. And what I mean by that is it's better to know what you want to do and then just say, is it A or B?
Yeah, with leadership, that's important to go in with the clear ask. They're a lot of
Yeah.
times they're really overwhelmed. So
Yeah.
you want to
You
make
know,
it easy for them to answer your question and give
yeah,
you
I mean,
guidance.
we pretty much know the answers. It's just we're told to do something some way. So if you're going to counter that, then you can just say, well, can we do it this way? That's where the creativity comes in, and the clarification comes in. But in order to have clarifications with creativity requires the clinician to be courageously confident. Because if you're not, then you're not going to be able to ask for a clarification using creativity.
So on the topic of advocacy, I know there's advocacy specific to supporting multilingual students and evaluations and making sure that they get access to the right services. So I'd love to shift to talking about advocacy for our last few minutes here. So I know that, both of you are involved in some advocacy work. So I'd love to just hear about your experiences there. Or like what kinds of work are you involved in? And yeah, I guess let's start there.
So, advocacy is something that can start in a very small way and lead to a very large sort of impact. And doesn't necessarily have to be something on the federal level. It can be just locally within your school district. But on a state level, there's been a lot of discussion about SLPAs in the schools. And so in New Mexico, there's current legislation where we're trying to, I should say, delineate their responsibilities of how they function in a school-based environment. And so even though there is administrative code on how they are supposed to be functioning, there is a need to have that code revised and have it polished. And so right now, there's a lot of talk about how SLPAs, also known as apprentices, we are the only state that calls them that, how they are going to, we are like in Illinois, we say slippas, right? But in New Mexico, they say apprentices. And so there's a lot of discussion on what that is going to look like. It's probably going to go to legislation this upcoming year, so on and so forth. And so current discussion has been on how we can work in, informing LEA directors of special ed on this information. So I have been somewhat involved with this process and hoping to help out in this area. Also, our state has a disability day where there's advocacy at the Capitol. We call it the Roundhouse here, but basically, anybody from any type of disability type of venue can show up. And so our state association, MCCG, represents themselves at this day annually. So that's some of the stuff I've been involved in. On a national level, I am representing ASHA through the Committee of Ambassadors for the state of New Mexico as the representative for SLPs. And so this year I've been involved in Hill Day through that twice. And I've done Hill Day before through a different CBC, which is the acronym we use for Committees, Boards, and Councils of ASHA. So I've done Hill Day a number of times, and it was a great experience. It's been lovely in terms of trying to build advocacy efforts with, what we're expected to discuss with our state senators and representatives. And so the federal affairs team of ASHA typically sets out, what the policy of, what discussion should look like. And so that information is actually available on the ASHA advocacy page, which is something that can be, looked at anytime with what are the typical points for discussion. And so, for example, year to year, it can kind of change, but like for schools, typically it's always been IDEA funding, but they also do, they also discuss other matters as well that would affect school-based SLPs. So I've been, I would say, a strong advocate in that regard, and I've really enjoyed being an advocate for what we do.
Prabhu, did you have something to add?
Sure, of course, yeah. Okay, at this juncture, I would want to bring up about ASHA's, the multicultural constituency groups. We are allied or related professional organizations. We are independent of ASHA, but again, we are a group of SLPs who represent various identities, and we have our own caucuses, right? So, for example, there is a South Asian caucus of ASHA, where Puja and I are members. There is the Asian Pacific Islander caucus. There is a disability caucus, Asian caucus, Hispanic caucus, LGBTA caucus. There's the new caucus that I'm looking at here. It's called the Men's Constituency Caucus. That's interesting. Okay.
Interesting.
That's MENA. That's the Middle East and North African caucus, Jewish caucus, and Native American caucus, and the National Black Association for Speech and Hearing, and Basla, you say it right? So there's a lot of caucuses here, and what we do is we collaborate. We collaborate with the ASHA office. We engage in various advocacy efforts of ASHA, and also we work together with them in an effort to increase our representation of multilingual SLPs and SLPs that's coming from various backgrounds, so that there's more visibility, there's more representation at the national level, and we are out there. We are not, an invisible minority. So we just want to show that we are there to support our students, and even working in nursing homes, we are there to support our elderly clients who are from various cultural and ethnic backgrounds.
What was the name of the organization? And you said you're separate from ASHA, but you work very closely with ASHA.
The multicultural constituencies of ASHA. I'll share the link here.
Yeah, if we could link to that, that'd be great.
And
I see it. I see it in the chat. We'll link to that.
Yeah.
So basically, the MCCGs are under the Office of Multicultural Affairs within ASHA. You may have heard of the acronym OMA, but they also put out a lot of information on multilingual assessment and multilingualism in general. So they're a great place to go for resources in case you ever need to find information that you need to feel, you feel like you need to connect the dots, so to speak. They're a great resource. They have a lot of information. I know Prabhu mentioned AJSLP earlier, I believe. And I typically don't go to AJSLP, but Prabhu, did you say that you find stuff through there?
There are some information that's practical information for school SLPs there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the big journals. It's kind of I remember when I was, in my doctoral program and talking about the different journals, and it was like, that was the big one, that you wanted to get published in. And it's just, considered one of the more rigorous ones.
And I think you would probably, like Prabhu said, have to do digging because it is such a big journal. Like
It is.
that's
I
why
mean,
I probably don't go there. But I feel like I've developed my own sort of protocol, which, if you don't mind, I would like to share it.
yeah.
And we talked a little bit earlier about the myths, and then I don't know if we talked about challenges, but
Yeah.
understanding how to assess is multi-pronged, multifactorial, and requires a multimodal approach. Not knowing how or whom to access for assistance with guidance and interpretation can be problematic. And not knowing ways to advocate when all ducks are not in a row is very problematic. And so the way I see it is the 3 C's of what we stand behind are clinical certification of competence, but I've put it into a 3-pronged process. So clinically, you need to seek out a skilled clinician. Okay, so that could be via Facebook through like a group, or you can make a request through the admin to help you of that group. There's a couple of really good groups on Facebook that are dedicated to multilingual, bilingual assessment. You can go through the ASHA Profine network. You could go through your own network in your district. So there's so many different ways to find a skilled clinician. Corporate is the second C, where you can seek out a company which can assist in decision making, which is known for information sharing and providing within this specific domain. So you want to first get a person, a clinical person, and we don't typically have people's hands to access, like nobody's going to call or email Kate Crowley directly, right? Maybe the person may not have a relationship with that person who's, producing the slam cards, but I guarantee you that if you look on that website, you could probably email someone there if you have a question. So it requires being proactive, but somebody may contact you and say, okay, yeah, this is how you would utilize the slam cards to do a bilingual assessment. This is what you're looking for. This is what you need to watch out for. Corporate, like most people have heard, I'm not here to promote any specific companies, but we all have heard of a few. Are we allowed to make a name recognition?
If you have one that you use and that you find helpful.
Bilinguistics out of Austin, Texas.
Okay.
I would say Bilinguistics is probably the go-to company that most people are, utilizing or know about. And then the third C is course. So for example, a CEU provider or the ASHA Learning Pass or whatever type of source you want to go to, where you can actually sit down and educate yourself through a course. A podcast is great as well, but you probably want to do a course where you could really learn. And courses are available all over if you just Google. But that's
your process.
Yeah. That's my process and tip for, really kind of just
getting started.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Basically. Yeah.
Prabhu, do you have anything to add before we wrap up?
No, pretty much Puja has covered everything.
Yeah. Well, we will link to all of these great resources that you mentioned in this episode. Did you want to share anything else? Places people can go to connect with you or learn more about some of the resources that you've mentioned today?
Yes, SAC, South Asian Caucus, as Prabhu was talked about. Prabhu was the past president. I currently serve on their executive board, but we also do have a page that is dedicated for contacting us or, if people require resources, they can contact us, and we typically respond right away to help, close the gap, so to speak.
Yeah.
So like, no pun intended with AAC, but you'd be surprised what types of requests people have, because we are in a very diverse communication industry. And so, when we get requests like, hey, I need help, we work right away to make sure we can pair up with someone from whatever state, whatever language, where that connection can be made rapidly and quickly. Prabhu, did you want to quickly, I know it's not like open, but you've also had specific groups that you have pulled together, right, in certain states?
Well, yeah, like I said, the advocacy is very important, and it's necessary that the SLPs come together, not necessarily during the state conventions or once in a year ASHA conventions, but meet frequently. Just it could be a gathering of SLPs in my city, in my neighborhood. I don't know you, you don't know me. As a matter of fact, I ran into somebody that lives in my same community. I didn't know that person is also an SLP. So there are people out there. It's all about social connections, right? So we are social beings anyways. So make connections, very important. So start small in your city, and then take it to the next level. And then, county, take it to your city hall. Just discuss the needs that you have. Just discuss the necessity for more funding, the need for more SLP-based services for underserving a population, so that just be more visible. Okay, make connections, be more visible, and advocate. Just want to say that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that. Puja, did you have any contact or anything you wanted to add before we wrap up?
No, if anybody needs to contact me for help, they're welcome to email me. I believe you were putting that information in our bios, right, Karen?
Yep. I'll stick all of that in the show notes. So
thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for all of the links where you can go to learn about all of the great resources that we mentioned in this episode, as well as where you can go to learn more about Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, my program that helps SLPs and other professionals working on language to create a system for language therapy. You can learn more about the program at drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. As always, thank you so much for listening. It helps me so much if you leave me a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you found this useful, please feel free to share it with your friends or colleagues. If you are interested in being a guest, if you would like to invite me to be a guest on your show, or if you have a suggestion for a guest, please send me an email at talktome@drkarenspeech.com. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time.